Alaska of all states has the most uncertain future. Alaska is basically the last frontier state because it's also one of the least populated states because it's very cold. Most of the people who live in Alaska live around the Anchorage area or live in Juneau and one of the many other cities that exist in Alaska. Alaska is basically a very isolated state, and unlike the rest of the northern parts of the country, of Canada, which are mostly liberal, Alaska is actually a very conservative state. But could that change in Alaska? Alaska's trends have been very, very strange, but Alaska has always stayed a safe red state. It has never the last time I voted blue was such a long time ago that it literally, yeah. Anchorage is one of the more red cities, and places like Fairbanks are very red as well. But Alaska is a very strange state politically, as the state has always voted for Republicans no matter who it was. And yeah, Anchorage has become more Democrat over the years, which is why the state has trended more leftward. But in the past, Alaska used to be a very, very, very Republican state. Mostly because nobody lives in Alaska. That is the thing. Alaska is the epitome of rural states. Outside of course, Anchorage and Fairbanks and Juneau, nobody basically lives in Alaska. Most of Alaska is very rural, but unlike most other states, Alaska's rurals are very more liberal than other states. Alaska's rural counties are much more liberal than most states, which again isn't really a problem because Alaska's rurals are basically like nobody lives there. And the last time someone won Alaska was in 1964 for the Democrats won Alaska. The first time Alaska was in a presidential election, Nixon won it by very close. But ever since 1968, Alaska has become a Republican state and went from a swing state then to a safe Republican state. No matter who was the nominee, Alaska would always vote for the Republican candidate. Yeah, there were boroughs in Alaska that always voted against the Republican candidates. But Alaska's state is pretty uncertain. So Alaska is a pretty uncertain state, politically. Alaska, even in one of the worst national environments for Republicans in history, Alaska still voted 10 points to the right to the country. Again, the country did trend left like every other state, but it is one of the worst national environments in 2020 history. Alaska being this close is typically mostly considered a fluke in politics, and it will likely bounce back as well. But the trends could go back in the Democrats' favor, but it is very unlikely this happens. One, Alaska is mostly a very rural state. Rural Americans are trending away from the Democrats at a massive margin. All we have to do is look at rural New Mexico and even Hispanic rural areas are trending away from, of course, the Democratic Party. Even places like Southern Texas, which was a Democrat stronghold for a century, basically, has trended away from the Democrats because the Democrats are basically becoming functionally extinct in rural America, even to the point where places that they should be winning, for example, South Texas, rural New Mexico, and rural Arizona, where it's mostly rural Hispanics, even they don't want to be at any part of the Democratic Party anymore. And really, the only closest in Texas is going to be because of the cities. If the city vote eventually outnumbers the rural vote in Texas, well, then Texas will be a Democrat state, basically. And of course, we're including the suburban votes as well, and they're losing those. But we'll talk about Texas far into the future, because we're only starting with Alaska and Alabama and all the A states. But Alaska, again, unless there was really no push to move to Alaska like Alabama, like we talked about. Alaska is a state that nobody wants to live in, and the people who do live in Alaska do not really, yeah, they're one of the least proud of states to live in. First of all, Alaska is very cold, which really restricts what types of people to go there. A lot more conservatives are going to move to Alaska because they're the ones who will be able to handle the coldness of Alaska. And Alaska is also one of the most pro-gun states in the country because, of course, it's Alaska. They love their guns, and no surprise that Alaska is very, very, very right-leaning when it comes to states. I think gun rights will be one of the major factors why Alaska does not turn blue in the next decade. As long as Democrats continue to trash on gun rights and the Second Amendment, which again a lot of conservatives move to Alaska, Alaska, like Alabama, probably will not flip. Alaska's demographics have not really changed within the past 50 years because, again, with the exception of more Filipinos moving there, which mostly move into the cities, they don't really go to the rest of Alaska where nobody lives, basically. And the rest of Alaska, basically, is still going to be red, even if Anchorage flips, basically, to the Democratic Party. And if Anchorage flips, Alaska might get like in flipping 5, or even flip. The only thing is if Anchorage flips to the Democratic Party. Next is the support is global warming. If the Alaska is getting warmer, and again, places around Anchorage and Fairbanks and all in these cities is already pretty warm. But if it gets warmer, it might encourage more people to move to the state, even if it is cold, because humans want to live in more places. And if a place is less as inhospitable as it used to be, like Alaska, Northern Territories of Canada, Yukon, and of course Nunavut, and of course Greenland, more people are going to be moving to these places. So Alaska might become a swing state by 2030 to 2040. But again, if the people who are moving there are more Christian conservatives and more Trump supporters and people who are conservatives, then yes, Alaska will stay a red state. It really depends on who really moves to the state. And again, one problem that Democrats are going to have to face in the future is the decline of atheism, mostly because of declining birth rate and because of near-death experiences becoming more and more popular among the people. Which again, and as of course that stuff gets more and more researched, basically one of the biggest Democratic platforms will basically fall on its head. So will Alaska become a blue state? Well, it is possible, but it is very unlikely Alaska will become a blue state, as most of the people who live in Alaska already, outside of Anchorage, are already very, very conservative people, outside, of course, the very north of Alaska, which again, nobody lives in that very north of Alaska, and have very little people living in there anyways, basically. But the more southern part of Alaska, where more all the conservatives live, is what's going to keep the state red probably for the foreseeable future. And unless there's a massive push to move to Alaska, which again, Alaska's already very expensive and already is very dangerous to live in. Then, with again, conservatives kind of want to live in a more tougher places than live in a city like LA or Chicago, which we'll talk about Illinois and California later, and the uncertain political futures of those states, and of course the uncertain future of a state like Illinois. Well, basically, we don't know what will happen to Illinois in the future. But that's basically about Alaska. Alaska is a state that doesn't really need much explaining. I think Alaska has 3 scenarios. One, it could stay basically a deep red state, or a state that will go be like South Carolina, will go from green, likely red, to basically safe red, or it could become a swing state, or it can become a blue state. The blue state is, I think, the least likely of the outcomes. I think Alaska becoming a swing state just like the Midwest is much more likely. But again, because nobody lives in Alaska and Alaska is such an unimportant state to the US electorate, I think that politicians will not really give a crap about Alaska and trying to flip Alaska. Because there's really no point in racing for free electoral votes. We can go for states that are actually gaining population like Nevada, states like Florida, states like, of course, the Midwest and the Midwest, where, well, again, the Midwest has become more of a swing area. States like Georgia, North Carolina, and of course, Arizona. States that are actually important to the U.S. electorate. That's basically it about this video. Goodbye.